When adding Spring Security to our project and configuring Web Security class, we have overridden one of the configure methods with Authentication Manager Builder, and we have provided this Authentication Manager Builder with the User Details Service interface. And this interface helps Spring Framework to load user details from our database. And to help it load user details from the database, we've also provided the password encoder that we use to encode user provided password, and the password encoding class is bcrypt password encoder. So now, because we have given Authentication Manager Builder the user details service, which is our user service interface, and we made that user service interface extend user details service that comes from Spring Security Framework, we are importing it here. We will need to provide implementation of one of the methods that this user details service defines. So if I go to user service implementation class, our user service implementation class implements user service interface, and because it implements user service interface and user service interface extends user details service from Spring, we will need to provide implementation of load user by username. And by implementing this method, we will help Spring Framework to load user details from our database by username. And in the case of our application, the username is email address. So the good news is that we already have user repository in our project. So I'll make use of that user repository, and I will delete this to-do task. And I will use user repository, and we already have a method that's called find by email. Here we go. Find by email, and I will provide email address, which we will receive as an argument to this method, email. Okay, and our find by email method, if I click on it to open its declaration, it returns user entity. So I will copy the data type, come here, paste user entity, and I will call it user entity as well. Okay, so now we have user entity, and we will quickly check if user entity is null, then we will return an exception. If user entity equals null, we will throw a new username not found exception. And this exception also comes from Spring. So let me copy and paste the email address to it as a message. So username not found exception is also coming from Spring. If I open its declaration, you see the package org Spring Framework Security Core user details. Okay, so let's go back to our user service implementation. Now we have user details from the database, and we know that user details is not null. What this method needs to return is a user object, and user object is also a Spring object that implements the user details interface. Remember, this method will be used by Spring Framework, and this method is helping Spring Framework to load user details from our database. So we will need to return a new user object, and this user object has a constructor that takes username, password as arguments. So we know that user entity is not null, and we can use it to get user email address, and we will get user password. And that should be encrypted password, encrypted with the bcrypt password encoder, which also comes from Spring. Let's import user, and it comes from Spring Framework Security Core user details. I'll import this, and there should be one more parameter. Let's open its declaration and look for a constructor. It takes username, password, and authorities, which is a collection. So we will create at this moment an empty array list like this, and let's import array list. Okay, here we go. So now we have a method which again is being used by Spring Framework. It's called load user by username, and it will help Spring Framework to load user details when it needs. And that method will be used in the process of user sign in. Our mobile application or HTTP client will send an HTTP post request with user details like username and password, and Spring Framework will use this username and password to see if it can find that user in our database. Okay, so let's continue.